Pilate's been trying to get out of doing anything against Jesus because he keeps saying he's an innocent man. We find no fault with him. But we're going to find out tonight that he finally caves in to the Jewish leaders and said in chapter 19 of John, if you don't know where we're at. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. I understand there's about 3 levels of scourging, and they do it a lot of times to try to get a criminal to confess. And it just kept getting harder and harder, and I understand they had a wooden stick with leather coming out of it, and then it branched off, and they'd put either pieces of metal or pieces of bone tied on the end of those things, and they'd stand somebody up to a stake, tie them to a stake, and where they'd be bent over, and the hide would be kind of tied on the back, and they'd hit them at least 39 times, I think it was. And Pilate's doing this hoping that once they see him beat up like this, that they'll okay for him to turn him loose, because he's concerned about this. His wife warned him, and even though Pilate wasn't a godly man, he was an ungodly man. He done some real bad things to the Jews that we'll find out here in a few minutes why he finally caved in to them and went ahead and had Christ crucified. And the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. You imagine having thorns, and I'm sure they didn't lightly put it down on his head. They probably just smashed it down there, and the pain from that, pain from the scourging. Most people, a lot of people didn't even survive the scourging. They would be bleeding so much from the cuts, and I understand they'd even whip them sometimes where they could actually see their inward parts, and I can't imagine that. But it's Romans were real cruel, cruel people, and. What's a purple robe got to do with anything?
It's a kingly color.
Right.
Color of kings.
It was a expensive color too. It took a lot of dye from, I forget, some kind of oyster or something or wasn't oyster, what was it? They had to get the purple from. Anyway, it was expensive, hard to come by. But that's something that a king would wear. Now, they didn't put it on him to say he was a king. They put it on him to mock him and to make fun of him. And said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him with their hands. One guy said that the Romans were so bored because where they were crucifying people, it probably cut down on the crime rate a whole lot, and you wouldn't want to be insurrectionists where you was trying to put down Caesar and all that. So they was no doubt bored, and he says that they would blindfold the prisoner and then start hitting him in the face. And if you know a punch is coming, sometimes you can dodge it a little bit or kind of lighten the blow. But if you don't know where one's coming from, it can do a number on you. just a solid hit, and so he's gone through that too. Pilate therefore went forth again and saith unto them, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. Pilate was trying his best to get out of this.
Himself from anything.
Yeah, trying his best. I find no fault in him. He didn't break any Roman law, and he really didn't break any Jewish law other than what he claimed to be. They didn't like that too well. It says, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know I find no fault in him. He wasn't about to condemn him at that time. Then came Jesus forth wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. And Pilate saith unto them, Behold the man, or look at him. Look at Jesus. Look at the man. And the chief priests therefore and officers saw him, and they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto him, Take ye him and crucify him, for I have no fault. I find no fault with him. Here he goes again. I mean, on and on and on he's saying, I find no fault with him. You crucify him. You want him crucified. And, of course, they couldn't crucify anybody. That wasn't their type of putting someone to death.
Mm-hmm.
But I've thought about this many times. They wouldn't put Jesus to death. They tried many times, and he just disappeared out of their sight.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, they had no trouble stoning Stephen to death, did they?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just the way it was supposed to be.
Right.
God's in control here. He's counting the shot, or bringing the details up, what they were supposed to do and what they wasn't supposed to do. Even though we're going to find out the one that turned him over to it had a greater sin. I want to point that out here in a minute when we get to it. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. This stirred Pilate up, even though he was not a godly man, didn't know the Lord, didn't know, wasn't a religious man. He'd heard about deities, people that was serving other gods. So he didn't want this at all. Said he was more afraid here in verse 8. And went again into the judgment hall and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. That stirred him up, so he went in and asked Jesus, where you come from? But Jesus didn't answer to him. And that bothered Herod too, because no doubt all the prisoners that he had or people that he had before him would be begging for their release or begging for their life if they had capital punishment. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and have power to release thee? Well, under Roman law he did, but Jesus had something to say about that.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did.
Said, Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Have you ever heard anybody say one sin just as bad as another sin? Well, the scripture here makes it plain that there is greater sins. It's all sin, but there are greater sin. So the one that, who do you think he's talking about here? Is he talking about the Jews, or is he talking about Judas?
I think he's talking about Judas.
Yeah, I do too.
Because that's who delivered him to them.
But they were just as guilty as Judas, wasn't they? Even though I do think he's talking about Judas here. Judas didn't last long, and I understand Pilate didn't last very long after this too. If you go back, Scripture doesn't say, but if you go back in history and find out that he didn't. From thenceforth, Pilate sought to release him, trying to figure out a way to get rid of him. What his wife had said to him, and that he said he was the Son of God, and he was just stirred up about him, which he should have been. Said, but the Jews cried out, saying, if thou let this man go, now here's their punch. If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. They could care less about Caesar. They didn't like the Romans. They were trying to
do the trick.
Yeah. They just wanted them to do the capital punishment here. That's exactly what they're after. Now, I understand Pilate had about 3 run-ins with the Jews over some graven images and stuff like that. And the next time that the Jews went to Caesar, he would either lose his job, probably lose his job for sure, but maybe even be put to death. So they had him. It's peer pressure.
Yeah. Well, especially saying that, you know, we told you he said he's a king.
Right.
And that would go against everything Caesar wanted.
Right.
So,
yeah,
they had him pretty good.
Yeah. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement. I'd never heard of the Pavement before, and this is the only place it's used in the King James Version. But it was a place that they had fixed. It was kind of raised up and made out of stone, and had a place for Pilate to sit, and then whoever was before him would be brought before him there, and everybody could see this judgment. But in the Hebrew, it was Gabbatha, if I got that right. And it was a preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, behold your king. I searched and I searched and I searched and I searched for the 6th hour here. Anybody got any idea what time it is? Huh?
Midnight.
Midnight? Okay.
The day begins at 6 p.m. The day ends at 6 p.m. The new day starts.
Yeah, it would for the Jews now. What's John going by here?
Oh, those Romans.
See, if you go from 6 hours from 6 o'clock in the evening, which would probably be sundown, that's what the Jews did, then you're looking at midnight there. This is probably Roman time, best I can figure out. Now even some translations will say it's noon here, but it can't be noon.
That's what mine says here. It says, what does it say in the morning?
The one I have says 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Mine says
That's one I finally found and settled down to. 6 a.m. in the morning, because if it was noon, Christ should be on the cross for 3 hours by noon, because he put on the cross at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he had to have some time from here to get to the cross. So I think it's 6 a.m. here, and it's not Jewish time. But there's a lot of controversy on that particular verse there. A lot of people think it's a contradiction too in the timing there. So about 6 a.m. in the morning, he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." The trial and everything had gone on. I don't know how they got piled out that early, but they did. But illegal trials too. All of them, I think it was 6 trials altogether. 3 from the Jewish and 3 from Pilate, what I understand. And none of them was legal because there was no defense there. None whatsoever. And when you have a trial with no possibility of defense, then it's not a legal trial, I don't think. But the preparation of the Passover was what everybody thinks he was crucified on Friday. I still not totally settled down to that, but if it was Friday, that's the preparation for the Sabbath, which Sabbath would be on Saturday. I personally think there was more than one Sabbath in that week, and because somewhere in Scripture says this was a high Sabbath, so it wasn't just a regular Sabbath. But I don't argue about that. So we just know this all happened. The timing really not that big a deal, I don't think. But it's real hard to get 3 days and 3 nights. Christ said that he'd be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, or the whale, whichever one you want to say there. Said the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. You can only get 2 nights from Friday. And a partial 3 days. So, he said, "Behold your king." Now this is not a, not him saying that he's a king. He just, look at your king now.
Yeah.
But they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." Pilate saith unto them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." They hate Caesar. They evidently hated Jesus even more.
Even more.
Because one of them said it's better for one man to die than the whole nation to go down. So, and now we have the crucifixion here. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified. They took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth unto the place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. We hear a lot of times about a hill Golgotha, and it was a hill, but that don't mean he was crucified on a hill. They usually crucified him on a road, a main road into town. And have you ever seen a picture of the skull, or this place here? In this rock formation, it looks like a face in it. Sure does. And then the garden tomb was pretty close to that, so the one they think that he was buried in. So more than likely they were down on road level, but it was lifted up anyway. Then delivered he him therefore unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. They would parade him, the ones that they was going to crucify, they would parade him through town also. And usually, doesn't say here in John, but it does some of the other, they would have a plaque around their neck hanging on their chest of the crime that they done. And we're going to find out what was written on that. John didn't mention it until they got to the cross, so. And bearing his cross went forth unto the place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. This is the place that they took him, and there was two others that they took along with him, where they crucified him and two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the midst. Now usually if they had 3 or 5 or 7, the one in the middle was the worst criminal. But Jesus was innocent. He wasn't a criminal. Jesus went to the cross. They didn't understand it, but he went to the cross. They say usually when they took somebody to the cross, they had to almost drag them there, because everybody knew they crucified a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew what happened when they was crucified. Do you know they wouldn't crucify a Roman? They were exempt from it. It said Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. John don't say nothing about the title when he was parading him through town, but and the writing was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Jews. He was definitely Jesus of Nazareth, and he told Pilate, he said, "Are you a king?" And he said, "For that reason I was born. I come into the world." Mm-hmm. But not at this time. He had to come and die. His kingdom, he told Pilate, said, is not of this world. Right. It was a spiritual kingdom. And I've thought about this many times. He's still setting up that kingdom. Mm-hmm. He's in heaven at the right hand of the Father, but he's still setting up his kingdom. Someday he's going to come back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords to rule here on earth for 1,000 years. That's millennial reign. And we can see there's no timeline for the rapture, which I believe the rapture will happen before the tribulation. There's no timeline for that one, but when you see the things that's in the tribulation getting close, and you can realize that the rapture's got to be close. It could happen any time, and we need to expect it at any time. We need to look for his coming. And this title then read many of the Jews, For the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Hebrew would be for the Jews, Greek would be for some others, Latin would be for the Romans at that time. So this stirred up the chief priest also. They then said the chief priest of the Jews to Pilate, write not that the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. I wonder why Pilate didn't give in to this like he did to the crucifixion.
Because this is how it's supposed to be.
Pilate answered and he said, what I have written, I have written. Get it, guys. I'm not changing it.
Tired of them.
Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. I understand they would be 4 soldiers put in charge of the crucifixion. And most everybody at that time would have 5 pieces of garment on. They'd have shoes, they'd have the inner garment, they'd have something on their head, and possibly another, like a shirt or something like that. Then they would have a robe, outer garment, it's called. And it would be woven from the top without any seams in it. I wonder how you'd weave something like that. They had a way of doing it, I guess. About everything we see now, we got a seam in it somewhere, don't we? Got a collar on it or something. This was not an uncommon thing. These soldiers would, and clothing back then was worth a whole lot of money. It wasn't like it is today in our society, where you walk in your closet and try to make up your mind what you're going to wear. They didn't have that much clothing back then. And Jesus didn't have a lot of things. Have hardly anything back then. He didn't really need anything other than what he needed to survive. So he wasn't into worldly things. So if each one got a piece of his garment, what did he have on? Nothing. That was part of the shame of the cross too. They'd hang there with nothing on. They said among themselves, let us not rend it or tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which saith, they parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things therefore the soldiers did. Christ in this fulfilled a lot of scripture. This is one of them here. As the lamb is taken to the slaughter, it just followed the shepherd.
Yeah, they don't follow that.
Yeah. So Christ did the same thing. He could have, if the Father had allowed him, he could have wiped a whole bunch out any time he wanted to, even we studied last week about how many soldiers that possibly come to arrest him. He could have wiped them all out. Matter of fact, he said, "I am," and they all hit the ground.
Yeah.
So truly, if Pilate didn't have any authority at all unless it was given to him by God the Father. So there stood at the cross Jesus, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. We have 4 women here. 3 of them named Mary, and I can't remember the other name, but and there's one guy here. Who is it?
John.
John, the writer of this book. Exactly right. So when Jesus therefore saw his mother, by the way, where was the rest of the disciples at?
Oh, they're probably hiding somewhere.
Locked up somewhere.
Yeah.
Christ told them that they would all be scattered too. And we know Peter denied him 3 times, so he wasn't there. He wasn't about to show up.
Well, and when he was risen from the grave, and Mary would tell them, they were all hiding behind locked doors.
Yeah.
And they,
Right. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, that's how John refers to himself, he saith unto his mother, "Woman," what would have happened if you called your mother woman? But he means no disrespect. This was a common thing back then. "Behold thy son." He's telling her that, John, behold your son. Yeah. "Then saith he to the disciples, Behold thy mother." He was making provisions even on
even on the cross.
on the cross. He was making provisions for her. And from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. Somebody said somewhere she lived about probably 10 years past this, so I don't know how old. Well, she had been at least in her 30s, between 30 and 35, 40, something like that.
Jesus was 33.
Yeah. They think between 33 and 40, so they don't know exactly. I always said 33 and a half, but
I thought I read someplace that she was 14
Probably when she had
she conceived.
could have, yeah. There's just a lot of things that we don't know.
No, for sure. Yeah.
I think we've only got one artifact, I guess you'd call it, from somebody being crucified back then. And the description of that was, I think their feet would be nailed separate. And then they'd have some type of little thing there for them to sit on. And then the nails would be in this part of the hand.
Not through the hand, but
Yeah, 'cause
actually through the wrist.
They say the hand won't handle.
Weight.
Right.
It would just rip through.
But these bones here kind of come together, and right through there would be.
Yeah, and they say the ankle is actually where they, not in the foot, but up
Yeah.
from the foot like the ankle, and there's a certain way they put it in so that it went in there and held.
And I understand that as long as they could raise themselves up, because if you couldn't raise yourself up, you'd suffocate.
Right.
What I understand. And Jesus was beaten so bad that, like I say, most of them didn't even survive that. Then he had to carry, they think, just a cross member of his cross. So he couldn't even make it all the way up the hill with that, or make it to the place of crucifixion with that. So they thought that weighed 70 or 80 pounds, so it'd be hard. Mm-hmm. I don't know why they had to have one so heavy, but and it goes back to Isaac when Abraham took him for the sacrifice. The wood was placed on his back for the offering that he would be sacrificed on. He told John, said, "Here's your mother." In other words, take care of her. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, saying, "I thirst." Forget how many prophecies that he really fulfilled in his crucifixion. There was set a vessel full of vinegar, and they filled a sponge with vinegar and put it up on hyssop and put it to his mouth, because he said, "I thirst." That was another thing, and dehydration would be awful. Nothing to drink. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." What's finished?
It's complete.
Plan of salvation.
Yeah. What he came to do, he
exactly
finished.
right. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost, or gave up the spirit. I believe when you die that your soul and spirit will immediately go to be with the Lord, because Paul said to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. But some don't believe that. Some think you just go to the grave and you wait for the resurrection. I don't think so. The Jews, therefore, because it was the Passover or preparation that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day. Now here it is. That for that Sabbath day was a high day. So I don't think it was a regular Saturday Sabbath. It might have been. So
because of the feast, you think it was a...
Yeah. Because Passover week would have more than one Sabbath in it. So, but that's just my opinion. I don't know if we can prove it anyway from any of the scriptures. Besought Pilate that they might, that the legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. The Jews was one that was asking for that. So then came the soldiers and brake the legs of the first and of the other, which was crucified with him. They done this because they didn't want him hanging on the cross on the Sabbath day. Said, but when they came to Jesus and saw that he was dead already, they broke not his legs. That was a prophecy right there too. Not a bone in his body would be broken. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. He shed his blood on a cross for us. And he that saw it bare record, and his record is true, and he knoweth that he saith true, that he might believe, that you might believe. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of him shall not be broken. Didn't need to break his bones because he was already dead. But they would break their bones, so break their leg bones, so they couldn't no longer raise up, and they would hasten to death. They claim some people hung on a cross for days. I guess depending on how bad they were scourged before they was put up there. Again, another scripture saith, they shall look on him whom they pierced. It said, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for the fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. And he came therefore and took the body of Jesus. Now we studied about this guy on back in a few chapters in John there. And there came also Nicodemus, which was at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. That's a lot of spices,
That's
that.
a lot of spices.
This shows that Joseph of Arimathea, which was kind of on the same line of Nicodemus too, they were both believers, but they didn't proclaim it along the way for fear of the Jews, because they would have been put out. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. I understand they wrapped them and they put a folded napkin on their face. If I understand right. And so now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden a new sepulchre, which wherein was never a man laid. And there laid they Jesus. Therefore, because the Jews' preparation day for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. And if you look at the place of the skull, pretty close to there is the garden tomb that they think that Jesus was laid in. So, and he done it all for us. And that's what we must believe in, his death on the cross, his burial, and his resurrection. And I think we're going to get into the resurrection here in the next chapter.